Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those of you who are in Asia and other places. Welcome to our webinar, Achieving Climate Goals Through Clean Cooking. Next slide, Forrest. Today we have a packed agenda with several partners today. We'll go through a quick introduction and talk about the climate and environmental impacts and other co-benefits of clean cooking. We'll do a bit of a deep dive into short-lived climate pollutants and clean cooking. And then we'll talk about clean cooking in the context of the Paris Agreement and NDCs. Then we'll really get into the meat of today, talking about measurement, reporting, and verification, and the technical support that the Clean Cooking and Climate Consortium will be providing over the next several months. So just a few webinar logistics before we get started. Please submit questions through the Q&A feature, not the chat, as we will not be answering questions via chat, and we will respond to those either today or in the next coming days. Please message about any technical difficulties or logistics via chat to the hosts and panelists. Please click on interpretation and choose the English, French, or Spanish channel. And then if you're on French or Spanish, you can mute the original audio under interpretation to avoid hearing quiet English in the background. We have a whole list of acronyms that you'll be seeing in this presentation. I'm not going to go through this list today, but you can refer back to these in case we forget to define the actual language before saying the acronym. So you'll be able to have this as a reference. All right, well, let's get started into the real presentation here. So we are the Clean Cooking and Climate Consortium. We provide technical support to low and middle income governments to achieve climate goals through clean cooking. We're a group of 5 organizations and agencies, and we'll go through and introduce all of these agencies one after another. First, we'll start with the Clean Cooking Alliance. I am Donnie Alexander, and I am the Chief Science and Learning Officer here at CCA. I lead all of our work on research, evaluation, and learning here. I'll also pass it over for a quick wave for Forrest and Alyssa. Forrest Robinette is our Senior Associate of Climate and Environment and has been supporting this work. And Alyssa Derby leads all of our standards and testing and is our Senior Director of Research, Evidence, and Learning at CCA and has also been supporting these efforts and is part of the consortium. Next, we'll pass it over to EPA. John, I'll let you introduce yourself and your team.
Thank you so much, Donnie. My name is John Mitchell, and I coordinate the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's clean air and cooking activities, and also coordinate the U.S. government's activities with other agencies. I'm joined today by my colleague, Jessica Kroner, who works with me on policy issues, and Jim Jetter, who runs EPA's research and testing laboratory at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. And we're delighted to be here today. Thanks, Donnie.
Thank you, John. Next, Gaj, I'll ask you to turn on your video from UNFCCC and have you introduce yourself and your team.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Gajanana Hegde. I work for the Mitigation Division of the Climate Change Secretariat, mainly working with standard setting and other regulatory issues in relation to carbon markets. I'm very happy to join this webinar and have a fruitful discussion. I'm also joined by Ariel, my colleague from Regional Collaboration Center based in Bangkok. Back to you, Donnie.
Great, thank you, Gaj. Sandra from the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, can you turn on your video and introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sandra Cavalieri. I work with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition Secretariat, and I coordinate our Household Energy Hub and work with national governments to help support implementation of household energy targets with respect to achieving climate, health, and sustainable development goals.
Great, thank you, Sandra. And last but not least, I would love to have Michael Johnson from Berkeley Air Monitoring Group introduce yourself and your team.
Thanks, Tony. And hello to everybody out there. We're really excited to present as part of the consortium as well. I'm Michael Johnson, the technical director at Berkeley Air Group. I'm joined by Dana Sharon, our managing director. Berkeley Air has many years of experience doing monitoring evaluation for household energy programs. We work with governments, NGOs, private organizations, and we're really excited about the opportunity to include household energy under countries' climate commitments for the Paris Agreement, and excited for supporting efforts through getting good MRV. So I'll pass it back to you, Donnie.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So we're going to talk really about why we're here today, and really the importance of including clean cooking in countries' climate commitments. We know that climate and environment impacts have significant that clean cooking has significant climate benefits, and we're going to talk about that along with the co-benefits. So burning wood fuels produces about a gigaton a year of CO2e, or about 2% of global emissions. These are the latest data from about 2015. We do think they'll be updated, but still be a significant contributor to climate change. Forest degradation from solid fuel use also leads to negative environmental and climate impacts. We see when we are harvesting fuel wood that we have not only impacts on climate, but loss of biodiversity, loss of erosion control, flood control, and desertification, in addition to the climate change. And so that's a really significant impact when we're harvesting the forest. In fact, some data say that in 74 countries, the amount of carbon released as a result of forest degradation was found to be about 4.3% of global emissions. And in addition to the impact on CO2 and forest degradation, the polluting fuels harm both the health and climate. So there's not just carbon dioxide. There is a whole host when you're burning solid fuels and kerosene. I'm not going to go through the entire list. It's incredibly long, but just highlight a few. Black carbon, which Sandra will talk about, is a short-lived climate pollutant that has major impacts on the climate and also health. We're seeing, carbon monoxide and methane, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. So a long list of health and climate damaging pollutants when burning these fuels inefficiently. In addition, we really see that household air pollution is a leading risk factor for premature death in low-income countries. The data show that annually up to 4 million deaths globally are attributable to household air pollution from the use of solid fuels and kerosene. These are WHO numbers, including both kerosene and solid fuels. The Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation has a lower number, but only looking at solid fuels. Regardless, it is a major contributor to premature death and to morbidity. And we'll see here in low-income countries, it is the leading risk factor for premature death, higher than low birth weight, smoking. It is the highest risk factor. It is really important for health impacts in these low-income countries. But we also know that, thank goodness, there's good news that transitioning to clean cooking solutions contributes to improvements in climate and health. It directly relates to the SDGs in many ways, in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we look at SDG 7, where there's actually an indicator for transitioning to clean fuels. But beyond that, there are several more that clean cooking touches upon. Climate, environment, health, women and girls and livelihoods, all of these SDGs are directly impacted by transitioning to clean cooking. We talked about health, climate, and environment. I want to talk a little bit about, beyond that, women and girls and livelihoods. We know that women and girls spend up to about 35 minutes a day average across low-income countries collecting fuel. Think about, or excuse me, that can be saved by transitioning to clean cooking. That is significant when you're saving 35 minutes a day. We also know that there are income opportunities when you transition to cheaper fuels. So transitioning from expensive charcoal, for example, to cleaner and cheaper fuels. So a lot of ways in which transitioning to clean cooking can support the SDGs in addition to countries in DCs. Next slide. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Sandra now to talk about short-lived climate pollutants.
Thank you so much, Donnie. And yes, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition was established in 2012. It's hosted by the UN Environment Program, and its aim is to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. So just to reiterate that this is a global voluntary partnership, and it right now consists of 73 state partners and 78 non-state partners. So really a growing group of countries and organizations working together to reduce short-lived climate pollutants. These include black carbon, methane, HFCs, and tropospheric ozone. We are guided by our 2030 strategy, which I really encourage all on the call to have a look at our 2030 strategy, where we are working with the partners and additional interested parties outside of the coalition to achieve mitigation of these short-lived climate pollutants, primarily through 6 sector-based hubs and also a national planning hub. And one of these sector-based hubs is the Household Energy Hub, and this is led by Ghana and the United States and includes a wide range of active organizations and additional countries working to achieve milestones that we set out in our engagement strategy for the sector. Right now, we are excited to announce that we'll be launching a call for proposals that will encompass work in the national governments and also in sectors themselves to advance short-lived climate pollutant mitigation. And the amount we have that we will be announcing is 9 million, which will be divided into like different categories. But it's really an opportunity to scale up niche pilot programs that we know work and to really advance in this immediate time period to mitigate black carbon and methane from the sector. Next slide, please. So to go into a little bit of detail on black carbon and methane, these are climate forcers that are many times more powerful than carbon dioxide. So and they are also air pollutants. And so they're not only harmful to the climate, but they're also harmful to human health and to agricultural productivity. When black carbon when we breathe black carbon, which is a component of PM 2.5, we damage our lungs and internal organs. It leads to stroke and heart disease, many adverse health impacts, in addition to being the leading environmental threat to human health, causing 7 million premature deaths annually. In addition, when black carbon lands on plant leaves, and when methane is in the atmosphere around the actual crops, they do not photosynthesize as properly, and this is also what leads to agricultural crop losses. And the sort of motivating piece about short-lived climate pollutants is that they only live in the atmosphere for a short period of time. So if we can stop the source and mitigate the pollution today, we will see an impact almost immediately for black carbon and in the very near future for methane. So if we look very specifically at black carbon, this has an impact on climate that's 460 to 1,500 times stronger than carbon dioxide per unit mass. So this is a really critical target to achieve climate and health benefits. And like I said, its average lifetime is very short. Black carbon is in the atmosphere for 4 to 12 days. So when you remove it today, you can see a benefit within a very short period of time. And also, I just want to emphasize that household energy for cooking, heating, and lighting is causing more than 50% of anthropogenic black carbon emissions. So this is a very critical source for governments to target to achieve these benefits. Next slide, please. And so for countries that are on the line that may not already be a member of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, I want to emphasize that countries are invited to join, and there's a process that's detailed on our website, and anyone is welcome to email me directly. Also, we encourage you to non-state partners who are on the line who would be interested in joining the Household Energy Hub are also encouraged to email us at the Secretariat, and I can be in direct contact with you to give you more details. We're really in this period now of scaling up not only our financial resources, but also our ability to network as broadly as we can to help implement the NDCs and other national policies to mitigate in this sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. And for the next few minutes, I will go through the clean cooking targets in the NDCs in the context of the Paris Agreement. It's a good sign to note that more than 60 countries include some targets in the area of energy efficiency or renewable energy supply for household energy supply. And a major portion of them include concrete targets for clean cooking. Next slide, please. Many of these targets are also linked to the cooperative approaches, which are linked again provided for in the Paris Agreement. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement outlines voluntary cooperation among countries to facilitate the implementation of the NDCs on one hand, but also to enhance the climate ambition. This is with the view that the efficiency of climate action can differ from one region to the other. So there is some scope to do it together by cooperating among countries to have this more efficient and more cost-effective emission reduction. So 87% of the parties in their NDCs submitted more recently indicate the use of cooperative approaches. Some of them indicate it as a condition to meet their mitigation targets, and others also include qualitative and quantitative limits to using these cooperative approaches. It's also important to note that the use of cooperative approaches is growing among NDCs. In the previous NDC analysis, this was only half of 87%, about only 40%, and now it's about 87%. Next slide, please. So cooperative approaches is not new to climate change area. They were used in the Kyoto Protocol era. In fact, under Kyoto Protocol, the clean development mechanism, I think most of you are quite familiar with it. And this clean development mechanism project started around 2005. And to date, nearly or more than 2 billion CERs have been issued. And this has resulted in something like 300 billion in climate investment across hundreds of countries. And some 200 million is also has come as a contribution to the adaptation fund from all of these efforts. Under the CDM, the cooperative approaches was an offset mechanism, meaning the actions are taken in one place and then they are used as offsets in other countries. So the net sum was 0. But in the case of Paris Agreement, since every country has taken targets in terms of their NDCs. The approaches are slightly different and also quite broader. So Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015, made way for three different options for cooperation. One is Article 6.2 mechanisms, which is titled Guidance on Cooperative Approaches, which allows for countries or group of countries to come together to achieve more ambitious emission reductions through cooperating in implementing the project and then transferring the outcomes of the project. Article 6.4, which is the rules, modalities, and procedures for the mechanisms, is more a centralized mechanism, somewhat similar to the CDM, but also with several differences. Article 6.8 is the work program under the framework for non-market approaches. Next slide, please. As you can see in this diagram, the household energy projects or clean cooking projects didn't participate in the CDM from the early years. As I mentioned, CDM took off in 2005, and probably peaked around 2008 or 9, but the household energy projects were quite absent from the pipeline. Because of the very nature of these projects, they are distributed and the emission reductions tend to be small and they are spread out in the wide geographic area. However, the rules of program of activities which were agreed under the CDM around 2008 or 9, and then they were refined by 2010, allowed a greater participation of household energy projects. And as you can see here, the POAs, there are nearly 73 POAs registered, and which include smaller component activities, more than 500 of them, and nearly 30 million CERs have been issued. This is because they allow addition of activities on a continuous basis, and they also bring down the cost of monitoring and MRV. And the good news is also there are provisions in the Article 6 to allow for some sort of transition of some of this project activities and program of activities if they meet some of the new conditions. And also some of the carbon credits which have been issued after 2013 for the projects which have been registered after 2013, they can also be used for compliance in the first NDC period. There are some conditions attached to it. I will not go into all the details, but the main point is there are provisions for the transition. Next slide, please. So what are the implications for this transition? One of the things is there is a desire to learn from the past, from all the projects, and then make it better for the future. So the UNFCCC Secretariat looked at the monitoring reports of many of these POAs and projects for clean cooking, hosted in more than 50 countries, and then noted that many of these projects brought in good practices over time. So many of the values used in to set the baselines and other assumptions, they are consistent with literature. But there are also other areas where there were areas of improvement noted, especially in relation to data collection. So much work lies ahead of us to learn from this experience and then make the system better for the future. Because the Article 6 mechanisms, they have more rigorous requirement for baseline as compared to the CDM. The 6.4 mechanisms, in fact, gives 3 options to set the baseline. They can be best available technologies, which are also economically feasible. They can be benchmarks of average top performing technologies. They can be historic emissions, but they have to be adjusted according to the NDC pathway or the pathway of the low emission development strategy of the country. So if we look at CDM projects and methodologies, mostly they use the historic emissions as the baseline. But in comparisons, there is a bit more requirement to apply for the Article 6 mechanisms. CDM standardized baseline, there were also many of them for clean cooking. To some extent, they use this benchmarking approach, looking at current application of different technology in the field and take the emission course of those technologies and choose the top certain percentage of among those technologies. However, that experience has to be further translated for the Article 6 usage. Next slide, please. So there are also, in addition to methodology or project design requirement, there are other requirements for the countries to participate in the Article 6 approaches. So the engaging in Article 6 activities involves consideration of the scope of the NDCs, targets included in the NDCs, and baseline setting, and the sectoral abatement costs of different technologies there, because some of this mitigation measures will be required to meet the NDC of the country. So the cost of the abatement is an important consideration, because if once it's transferred, it's no longer available to the country for its own use. So the question to the country would be then whether to engage in Article 6 activities and which activities should be included. And once those activities are included, how to ensure the availability of the data for the selected approach, because there is a lot more responsibility for the host country as compared to the CDM, where host country can even specify more rigorous approach than some of the existing methodology approved by, for example, Article 6.4 body whenever it comes into existence. And also the effective use of Article 6 cooperative approaches would entail detailed accounting and reporting requirements for the country, which means these elements have to be integrated into national climate change policies and institutional framework. Nevertheless, there is likely to be high demand for the credits or the so-called ITMOs, only if some quality assurance can be provided, especially for energy access projects with high sustainable development benefits. The experience shows that there is usually higher price offered and there is high demand. And already there are some initiatives to look at different methodologies which are applicable in this sector and rate them in accordance to the parameters, the rigorousness of the parameters, the performance issues included, and the MRV requirement. And as I mentioned, the price which is offered could very much link to the quality attributes. So it's a responsibility of everyone involved to make all these requirements harmonized and then to increase the quality level so that these cooperative approaches can be leveraged to achieve high level of ambition in NDCs and to make it a great tool to meet the Paris Agreement targets. Next slide, please. Good news is also, although the Article 6 rules were only recently approved in detail in the Glasgow Climate Summit, there are already few sectors which have been covered by pilot projects. Many of them are hosted by Switzerland. For example, there is this biogas projects between Switzerland and Senegal, Switzerland and Ghana. And also World Bank has initiated several programs to support countries. Many of them cover biogas, and also Swedish agencies. And clean cooking is also among some example projects, pilot projects. Clean cooking with ethanol is also included in some World Bank pilot projects. And as we speak, more is coming on board, and it's likely to grow leaps and bounds, because some of the recent studies do show that the potential is very high for this as compared to the 2 billion which was transacted under CDM at an average price of $2. The future market is expected to be something like 300 billion by 2030 and going to something like $1 trillion in 2050 in many of the projections among studies conducted. So we are very hopeful for the future of the market mechanisms, but we all have the responsibility to increase the rigor and increase the quality level. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Gaj. That was some really good background. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the measurement, reporting, and verification component of this webinar and some thoughts that we've had on helping build up, hopefully, what will be a common platform for countries to use in their MRV systems. So next slide. All right, so first, let's just talk about what MRV actually is. And I think Gaj made a really good point earlier about how solid MRV is going to increase the quality of the asset in itself, right? So MRV is kind of the heart of how you get at quantifying emission reductions. And if you have a good MRV system, that's going to create more value for the asset. And in this case, that's emission reductions, right? So here specifically, we're talking about a system which allows us to quantify progress towards climate goals, right? And this is for household energy, and that's really probably the most important part of MRV. But it's also really important because it gives you feedback on how a program or project is performing. And if you have that information, that's going to allow you to potentially adapt or adjust a program or project or technology so that you can maximize your effort towards getting more emission reductions. So just getting that information is really critical as well. And then this third component, which is not perhaps quite as exciting, but it is important that we're reporting things in a way that makes sense, that's common, that feeds into the system and can be communicated in a way that makes sense to stakeholders as well. So all of these things kind of go into an MRV system. And again, it's about building that quality, having trust in the assets that, in this case, emission reductions that are being estimated for a household energy program or projects. Next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about how we actually calculate emission reductions for household energy. It's a little bit different than in other sectors, but there are also some commonalities. So one of the commonalities is for almost any situation or any program, regardless of its household energy or wind farm or whatever the case might be, you're going to have some type of a baseline scenario and a project scenario. For household energy, you have emission factors, which are associated with the type of fuel or technology that's being used. So thinking about how much methane or carbon dioxide is being emitted per ton or per megajoule of fuel. And then you also need to know how much fuel is actually being consumed. For a lot of these projects, it's going to be a lot of biomass, wood, charcoal, maybe crop residues, pellets, things like that. But there's also biogas and ethanol and electricity and some other technologies as well. But you have to know how much fuel is actually being used. That's really important as well. And then the third input that's quite important for quantifying emission reductions in household energy programs where biomass is being used is you need to know how sustainable that fuel is being harvested, because you can only count the CO2 emissions that are associated with non-renewable use of that fuel. So if you have trees that are being harvested unsustainably, then the CO2 that's emitted from that unsustainable harvesting stays in the atmosphere. Whereas if it is sustainable, then that CO2 is going to get taken back up in the next round of growth of that forest or whatever the stock is that's providing the biomass. And that's something that we call the fraction of non-renewable biomass, but that has to be quantified as well. And that's a really important part of these emission calculations that we do for household energy. So that's just a little bit of background. So thinking about these are kind of the big components when we're building an MRV system for household energy. Next slide. right? And so thinking about those components for an MRV system, when we measure those, it's really important to use best practices, right? And they're especially important for household energy because there are some kind of unique considerations for household energy. For one, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but it's not like a wind farm or a power plant or something that's kind of located in one place. The sources are distributed over many different homes, and so you have lots of these distributed point sources, and so you're not going to be able to go and measure the emissions at each and every household. So you have to be smart about how you're sampling or accounting for that. And then because there are all these different point sources, there's going to be variability in stove use patterns and demographics and fuel conditions and things like that. All these things that are going to impact the amount of emissions that are coming from both the baseline and the project scenario. So, thinking about these different sources of variability and these point sources, it's kind of unique for household energy and something that needs to be accounted for in MRV systems. Right. And so when we think about some of the best practices, these are just a few examples of what's going to be important. Number one, having a really good baseline data collection effort, right? So again, because of that variability, making sure that you're able to quantify what those baseline fuel consumption estimates are, things like that's going to be very important. Luckily, we have some tools, so that's that next point. We can measure fuel consumption. It's generally in the lab or the field or a combination of them, but we have some best practices and some tools from ISO to help us do that in a really kind of robust way. Another component, and this is a really important one that again is somewhat unique for household energy, is that you have stove use patterns that are going to be kind of different and changing, especially when people are going through a transition from a baseline technology to a newer technology. And I'm sure if anybody's like me in my kitchen, I use lots of different appliances to cook. And so thinking about how to measure that mixed stove use in a house is really important as well. And then this last one, this is an important one. I just mentioned this idea of the fraction of non-renewable biomass. And some of the ways that that number has been estimated in the past have provided estimates that are not terribly conservative, really high numbers. So that means if you have a high fraction of non-renewability, that means that you are assuming that most of your biomass is not being harvested sustainable. And so you're counting most of the CO2 emissions that are being emitted from the stoves. But there are better approaches that give more conservative estimates. And this is just a kind of a good opportunity to think about this in concrete terms as well. So if you're not using a conservative estimate, say 0.9 or something like that, and you do your calculations and it comes up and says, okay, well, each home is saving 4 tons of CO2 equivalent every year, right? And that may sound good because that's a big number, right? It's going to mean, oh, more emission reductions. And that, for a carbon market or a program, that may sound good, but if people don't have confidence in it because it's not a conservative or accurate approach, then the value of that is not going to be as high. Whereas if you use perhaps a more realistic number like 0.25 or 0.4, then the amount of emission reductions you can count might be less, might be 1.5 or 2, but the quality of that asset is going to be higher. And if people have more confidence in these assets, then that's going to hopefully bring a higher price to them as well. All right, next slide. All right, so it can be a little daunting thinking about building up an MRV system for household energy because there are all these kind of components and things to think about, and different countries are going to be different places with their ability to build up that MRV system. So luckily, there's this way to kind of show progress towards your climate goals for household energy in the short term that can be used before that MRV system is in place, and that's using key performance indicators. So key performance indicators, they aren't a way to quantify those emission reductions yet, but just to show that you're going in the right direction, right? So they're just simple measures. And so they could be things like information is already being collected on surveys about types of fuel that's being used or types of stoves that are being used. Or maybe there's a national inventory of electrical connections or LPG use or things like that. Again, it's supposed to be information that as it tracks over time can show progress, but it's not going to fully quantify those emission reductions yet. So again, it can be a little daunting to think about these MRV systems because there's lots of considerations and components, but just setting up a simple way to track progress initially can give countries time to build up those MRV systems to the point where they feel comfortable quantifying the carbon dioxide equivalent reductions when everything's in place. All right, next slide. I want to touch briefly on one of those tools I mentioned earlier. We have new ISO standards that many countries are starting to adopt or adapt right now. So this is a really exciting development in the household energy sector. And it's kind of important to know a few things about this. One is that these were standards that were developed by our community, right? So everybody who was involved in household energy could get involved. And so there's something that we developed and think that they have, we think that these are kind of best tools right now for testing stoves. And right now we have harmonized protocols for lab testing, and we also have a standard for field testing. So there are tools to help us quantify things like thermal efficiency and fuel consumption in the field. And again, using ISO standards is nice because it provides both really good solid protocols, but also confidence, because if you say you're using an ISO standard, it's gone through this very rigorous process, this consensus building process. And so, they're good, well-respected protocols to be used. I mentioned that many countries are adopting or adapting them right now, but any country can use them or any organization can use them. They're available for any purpose. So it doesn't matter if you're not an ISO country or a country isn't adopting them, they can still be used as part of an MRV framework. And there are a couple kind of specific applications to think about here. One is that testing stoves may help kind of benchmark what the best available technologies are in different contexts. Different countries and different geographies are going to have different fuels and different needs and different kind of a different ecosystem of stoves. And so kind of helping to identify what stoves are going to work best. That's something that the standards can do. The other thing is that also a tool for stove development. So, right now, the performance of our stoves is X, but in some years it could be Y, right? We can improve, we can move up through the tiers. And so we can move up through performance. And so these standards help us identify how to improve stoves and what that improvement might look like. All right, next slide. So just to sum up, I've touched on this already, but strong MRV systems really increase the confidence in the emissions reductions that we're going to be estimating. And I kind of think about this in two different buckets here. So part of this is just having really good sound science, best practices. Those are going to result in robust emission estimates, right? People are going to have confidence that if you say this stove technology or this program is resulting in 2 tons per household per year, and you're using those best practices, people will say, okay, yes, absolutely, we believe that's great. And that increases the value of those assets. And of course, that's also just important for making sure that we're hitting our climate goals. We want to be accurate in those estimates. But then the other part of this is having a common MRV framework that lots of different countries are using will provide confidence as well. So having harmonized approaches and consistency in application, and there are going to be less questions than if it's a patchwork of different MRV approaches and different ways to quantify emissions. They're coming up with slightly different estimates and things like that. That could cause some confusion and potentially lead to kind of decreasing the value of the emission reductions that are being achieved in the sector, just because there are differences in the way it's being done. So again, if we have really good sound science and best practices that we're using, and then we also are using a common approach, I think those two things put together will result in an MRV platform that's really going to get back to what Gosh said, ensuring that we have that quality of these emission reductions that we all want. All right, well, I think that's it. So this is again how we kind of envision the MRV system, and it's still something that we're working on, but that's what we're thinking about the what, but then how are we going to actually support countries who are going to take on this effort. And so I'm going to hand it over to Alyssa to talk about some of those specifics.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I'm excited to talk to you about the technical support that our consortium, the 5 organizations represented here today, are planning over the next few months. We call ourselves 4C, short for Clean Cooking and Climate Consortium. So we imagine that many of you are joining us from countries that are among the list of 67 that have either included specific clean cooking goals and targets in their NDCs, or have included adjacent goals and targets. So sectors like forestry and air pollution, household energy, that can be a scaffolding onto which we can add clean cooking activities as a way of achieving those emission reduction goals. Next slide, Forrest. If that is true of your country and it doesn't appear on this list, please let us know so that we can make sure to update our records and adjust our outreach accordingly. Most of the technical support that we're planning over the next months are specifically targeted towards these countries, but happily will be broadly applicable beyond as well. Next slide. So the first 2 more broad offerings from 4C include 2 guidance documents. The first is an introductory framework for MRV in the Paris context that really lays out all of the detail and builds on the guidance that you just heard from Michael. The second is a roadmap for developing clean cooking programs to achieve emissions reduction targets. So they're companion documents, and they're both in working draft form right now. So after this webinar, we will send these documents to everyone who registered for the webinar with an invitation to review them and provide any feedback you think would be helpful for improving them so that we can better meet your needs as we move forward. So we are excited to hear from you how we can make these even more useful to your needs and start engaging on the technical support that we're providing. Next slide. And in addition to the broad guidance documents that can be used by anyone, we are planning to offer office hours where we can go into more in-depth technical support for countries that are in the process of implementing their clean cooking plans and run into questions and concerns along the way. So the way these will work is we will invite everyone who registered for this webinar to fill out a form online if interested in receiving this technical support, and we'll select an initial cohort from this group of up to 10 countries. We will collect all of the questions that countries have, and then we will bring in the relevant experts to be able to answer those questions live during an office hours style tutorial where we can get into more in-depth questions than rather just providing an answer. They will have an opportunity for discussion back and forth. And we're going to drop the link to that form in the chat right now. So if you want to go ahead and click on it, you'll be able to have that open and fill it out when we're done. But we'll also include the link in the follow-up email that we will send to you later today. Next slide. And lest it seem like we 5 organizations that comprise 4C have been doing this work in isolation, let me assure you that is not the case. We have been extremely fortunate and grateful to be working in parallel with a number of other partners who bring their own expertise in clean cooking and/or climate to the table and have offered us guidance and support and recommendations and feedback on all of our plans and materials over the course of the last year. And I'm just going to include a few of them here just to share information with you all about the services that they provide that is relevant to the work that we're discussing here. These include NDC Partnership, the Gold Standard Foundation, ARENA, next slide, and NDEV. We've worked with other organizations as well that I just want to thank everyone out there who's helped us along the way. For example, UNDP facilitated a number of really important stakeholder consultations that we undertook last year in figuring out the best way to provide support. So when you receive these slides by email, you'll be able to click on all of these links and learn more about all of the programs that these partners are currently providing. Next slide. And with that, we go into the Q&A session. And we've already received a number of questions for all of our presenters. So I'm going to go ahead and start facilitating that. And we'll invite the presenters to turn their videos back on when they're answering questions. Obviously, their microphones too. So first up, Sandra. I think you piqued everyone's interest with reference to that $9 million in funding. So I have a two-part question for you, which is, how can countries receive support from CCAC? And also, how do I know if my country is a member of CC yet or not?
So thank you so much. And that was my intention. So yes, so let me go into a little bit more detail. So first, the way to find out if your country is already a member of the Climate and Clean Air Coalition is to look on our website, which I've put a link in the chat that I think everyone can see. And so if you click on that link, you should be able to see the list of 73 state partners. And then as far as the $9 million, I would like to clarify. So essentially, all of our ODA eligible countries in the CCAC have been completing a process called the expression of interest. And so many countries on the line may know, or if you don't know, you can contact your CCAC focal point to ask about this. And this process is going to be an ongoing process whereby countries can continuously update their expression of interest form to request new types of support that are related to mitigating short-lived climate pollutants. So this process we've gone through one iteration, but it's never over. So if there's an interest from your country, then please definitely contact me. And the way that the funding is going to be organized is that there will be three types of programs. So and each of these three types will each have $3 million. So there will be $3 million to support national governments in their specific planning needs related to short-lived climate pollutants at the national level. And this will involve supporting interministerial working groups on short-lived climate pollutants and advancing on implementation of the NDCs, and also on very specific, like, country requested support at the national level to plan for mitigation. It's going to be varying by country, but the broad understanding is it's national planning. And then the second bucket of $3 million is to support national governments in implementing sector-specific needs of their country. So if the country has a very targeted need related to household energy and they express this as a request, then the $3 million will be going to countries to support their sector-specific needs. And then there's a third bucket of $3 million, which is to advance on our work in each of our 6 sectoral areas. So for household energy, we have a household energy engagement strategy. And I can share the link to that engagement strategy. And that is the foundational, most important document for us for household energy, because it outlines where we see our opportunities through the CCAC to help scale up support at the national level, and also how we see we can scale up support to raise awareness, really global awareness in this area. And so I'll put that in the chat. So I hope that was helpful. And the calls for proposals will be coming out in the sort of June, July timeframe. This is a new process for us. And we're finalizing the process with our board. And so this is something that if your country is a member and you don't know who your focal point is, you can contact me and I'll connect you. And that way you can then begin to receive information as a partner of the CCAC and stay up to date in this matter.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. And as a reminder, the slides will be distributed to everyone. We'll send them to you by email after the webinar, and the contact information for CCAC will be included in the slides. Gaj, the next question is for you, which is, can private sector entities also come together and bundle projects under the cooperative approach? And I assume this is in the Paris context we're discussing.
Thank you, Elisa, and indeed important question. Definitely the cooperative approaches are designed for private sector participation. In fact, some of the pilot projects also show that private sector is actively engaging. It can happen in several layers. Some of the models which have emerged, they include agreement among two countries at the policy level or policymaker level, which sets out the broad approaches for cooperation. And then beneath that, there are several agreements among private sector participants to actually implement projects. So definitely there is a lot of room for private sector participation, and in fact that will be much needed, because public sector itself will not be able to finance the much needed activities for the meeting the Paris Agreement goals. Back to you, Elisa.
Thanks, Gaj. That's helpful clarification. Thank you. And both in clarification and encouragement. Michael, next question is for you. You mentioned electric cooking in the context of your presentation. So here's a multi-part question for you, which is, what fuels are eligible for financing under these mechanisms? I hear a lot about electric cooking. Does that qualify? Is the MRV for electric cooking different from biomass? So over to you.
Yeah, good question. And there is a lot of excitement around electric cooking right now. There have been some kind of new studies and work showing both its potential for displacing a lot of kind of more polluting technologies, and also ways to monitor it in kind of smart, kind of more tech savvy manners as well. So yes, absolutely, electric cooking can be included. I mean, the important consideration for electric cooking is that the power generated for the cooking is going to come from some source. So certainly have to account for whether or not that electricity generation is renewable or not, what the emissions from that are going to be. But there are emission factors for production of electricity for grids. And so there are mechanisms for that. And there are kind of some interesting new ways to track how much usage is being done by integrating little meters into those cooking technologies to let you know how much it's been used, to let you know it's used 20 kilowatt hours in a given month or whatever the case might be. So having a really precise estimate that's just built in, instead of trying to guess through surveys or proxy measures, there are some ways to maybe measure that are really exciting. There are also new methodologies for biogas. I know that's another potential technology that people are excited about. It's been around for a while, but hasn't been incorporated into as many kind of carbon offset programs because of some of the challenges in measuring emissions associated with a biogas project. Because you have more than, again, it's a system where you have more than just emissions of the stove, right? You're producing this biogas, you're potentially producing emissions, when the digester is creating the methane, and just considering all of the places along the production of the biogas. So again, there are methodologies for that, and excited to include that in MRP framework as well. So basically any fuel where you can quantify the emission reductions can be included, but there are unique considerations for some of those different fuels and technologies.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And a somewhat related question for Donnie. Your question is, what stove fuel combinations provide the greatest win for the climate?
Hi, yeah, well, that's also a really complicated answer. In general, we see all things being equal when we think about baselines, transitioning to the clean fuels, so the liquid fuels provide the best win. And we look at biogas and ethanol as probably the best wins for the environment. And if electricity is produced sustainably, so through hydropower or solar, that is, of course, the best win. And surprisingly, transitioning to LPG from baseline in most cases is also a climate win. And that is because, again, as Michael mentioned earlier, when we talk about the fraction of non-renewable biomass or how sustainable the wood fuel source is, due to the fact that, in general, there is a fraction of that is unsustainably harvested, we see that transitioning to LPG, even when taking in the life cycle of the production transport of LPG, is a climate win. So yeah. And then also when we look at some of the much more advanced biomass stoves, so the pellets or the gasifying stoves that burn pellets, you're seeing huge wins for the climate, environment, and also health as well. We're seeing even health impacts with some of those biomass stoves as well. So I would say a suite of the more clean fuels, and then looking at the best performing biomass stoves also are going to get you the biggest wins.
Thank you, Donnie. It's a nice reminder that climate and health wins can go together. As a sector, we used to talk a lot about the trade-offs between whether something was good for health or good for the climate. And it's exciting to be able to achieve both of those goals now together. Okay, Sandra, back to you. We have some follow-on questions about the support available from CCAC. A two-part question for you. The first part is, can support include basic baseline for households or similar? And then also, is this window open to government entities only or to private entities? Who is eligible to apply for this funding?
So as I mentioned, the exact fine details are being worked out. So I don't want to share any misinformation. So I think I need to just wait on the very specifics of the eligibility, but it is targeted at national governments, targeted to work with national governments, and that there would be implementers who would work with the government. So I'm sorry I can't be more specific right at this moment, but please stay tuned. And regarding the household level, I think this is also really in line with the targets that the government has set and how we can best support the government achieving their targets. So I think that this is really about the CCAC is really looking for what a lot of organizations are looking for, is with respect to this kind of transformational change, and looking for the niche opportunities that we can provide to really help governments advance quickly on their objectives. And so I think it's really going to be very context specific, but really looking to leverage work that like this whole partnership is bringing forward to really move things forward in this area. And all of our information, as soon as it's finalized, will be on our Climate and Clean Air Coalition website. So just please stay tuned, and I'm happy to help as we get more information.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Gaj, I hope you're ready to jump into some detail on nuances, because here's a question for you. So with regard to transition of CDM activities to Article 6 mechanisms, so first part, are there any provisions related to the use of currently applied methodologies, for example, AMS2G in the case of cookstove projects? And second part, given that clean cooking projects are generally undertaken as a program of activities, are there any specific provisions for a faster or more simplified process for transition?
Thank you, Elisa. Indeed, for the existing projects and program of activities, they can use the methodologies that has been applied till the expiry of the grading period or until 31st December 2025. So after which the new methodologies, which will be approved by then by the new body for Article 6.4 mechanism, that has to be applied. But until 2025, they can be applied. On the question on the POAs, definitely there are provisions which require the Article 6.4 supervisory body to prioritize and expedite the methodological work and the other requirement for POAs to be done speedier than the other areas. So that's why there is expectation that this issue will be taken up early on, and there are already 2 meetings which have been specified for Article 6.4 body during this year itself.
That's great.
Back to you.
Thank you, Gaj. Wonderful. Okay, and now we're back to Michael. And I'm going to go ahead and give you 2 different questions at once to take advantage of reducing transitions between respondents. So the first question is, what is involved to monitor some of the main inputs for estimating climate reductions, which we've already touched on a little, but could use some more detail. And the second question is, what are some of the ways that current methodologies might be changed or improved?
Right. Yeah. So there's potentially a lot to discuss here, but maybe just going back to those kind of 3 different inputs I talked about before. You have emission factors, you have fuel consumption, and then you have the fraction of non-renewable biomass. So starting with emission factors, right now emission factors people use are generally default emission factors from the IPCC, and they're just kind of by fuel type. And there are a couple of specifics here. So one, right now in the CDM methodology, the emission factor that gets used for wood, for example, is actually based on a combination of fossil fuels. And that's because of the restrictions within the Kyoto Protocol and what could be counted, not be counted, not because of science, but because of just this restriction. And that goes away with the Paris Agreement. So one of the things that can be done is the use of what will hopefully be better emission factors. One of the things that we're trying to provide through this effort is a better set of fuel and technology specific emission factors. That's another component, is that right now the emission factors that you use for any wood stove, for example, are the same default emission factors. Be it either through the CDM with that blended fossil fuel emission factor gets applied for wood, or maybe it's the gold standard methodology where it's just the regular wood emission factor. But you're not taking account for any differences in combustion between a 3-stone fire and a super advanced, forced draft stove that burns very cleanly. And there is a lot more data now available to help us maybe provide default emission factors for different types of technologies. It's always best to go and measure them directly, but it's probably unrealistic in many cases to go out and do emission studies. It's pretty complicated and technically probably just not feasible. So that's one thing for emission factors. For fuel consumption, generally the way that you especially get baseline fuel consumption is some type of the survey, and best practice would be measuring that directly in some fashion, be it with surveys or some type of a metering system where you're getting kind of objective direct measurement of that fuel consumption estimate. So again, there are some new methods or updated methods where we're hoping that we can incorporate those into the MRV system. I'm thinking about project emissions. Again, could just go measure those in the field, and that's kind of best practice. And again, if you have smart ways to do that or technologies that are tracking how much is being used directly, that's ideal. But we also have these ISO tools to help us understand what the changes in thermal efficiency between baseline technologies and project technologies might be. So just using those ISO protocols in a smart way is also going to be important. And then the third one was the fraction of renewable biomass. And we already talked about this a little bit. Right now, the methods that most people are using are pretty simple. And the calculations have led to some not very conservative estimates. It's kind of changing. There have been some updates to methods recently, but really this is an opportunity to maybe use the best estimates that we have, which are based on kind of more granular, specific modeling of the amount of biomass that's being removed and the demand and how things change over time. And there's a lot of information that's already available from work where you probably have better default estimates of this non-renewability estimate. And so making sure that we're recommending kind of the best approaches there is going to be an important part of this MRV as well.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I think we are going to go back to Gaj for the next question. Gaj, the question for you is, are there any specific provisions for capacity building for host parties under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 rules?
Thank you, Alyssa. Indeed, there are specific provisions, both in Article 6.2 guidance and Article 6.4 guidance, where the regional collaboration centers of the Secretariat, in consultation with the parties, are asked to provide help where required. This could be to set up institutional mechanisms to deal with all the requirements on reporting and monitoring the projects. It could also include setting the baseline or the basic participation requirement for market mechanisms, particularly for LDCs and seeds. It could also include transition of existing CDM projects into Article 6.4 projects. So there are indeed many provisions, and even budget provisions have been included to help the countries make this transition or take up the opportunities under the cooperative approaches.
Great. Thank you, Gaj. I think we have time for one last question, and Gaj and Michael, maybe both of you would be able to comment on this, or either of you. So one question is how to make methodologies that are energy oriented and methodologies that are focused on agricultural, forestry, and other land use, the AFALU oriented methodologies, compatible when cookstove projects are implemented. It's unclear how to apply an MRV system when the activity project has impacts in two sectors, namely energy and RED, meaning forest degradation. So this is a challenging issue for many countries, which include mitigation targets regarding cookstove initiatives.
Sounds like a good Gaj question to me. I'll give all the hard ones to Gaj. But I mean, just broadly, right? You can't double count. You don't want to double count. So if you're counting an emissions reduction in the household energy sector that has, you know, the non-renewable factor that's associated with, you know, some change in forestry, then you wouldn't want to count that emission reduction that would otherwise be incorporated into a RED or some other project activity. So, but I'll give that to Gaj. I mean, I think there are some tools to help with that, but that's definitely, I think, up your alley.
No, indeed, it's a very important question, and it also shows the importance of the forum like this. And this is a critical question because the savings in wood fuel or savings in the forest areas are now covered under land use sector or a FOLU, as mentioned in the question. And whereas it's also reported in the energy sector when it comes to cooking, the wood fuel used for cooking. And the MRV itself depends really on the scope of the NDCs and the intention of the country, whether the country wants to use the cooperative approaches or whether the climate finance is also one of the means of implementation. So if indeed the intention is to use the cooperative approaches or the climate finance, there is likely more requirement for MRV. And then it depends on the methodology applied. And currently, the methodologies which were in use so far under Kyoto Protocol or in the private sector, they need a lot of data collection from the field, which many of them were covered very well by Michael. So yeah, if there is the intention to use that, then all of the requirement to know the baseline wood fuel use and set up a conservative baseline and also monitor the project implementation depending on the type of technology employed. All those kind of things come into play. But indeed, it's a challenging area. In fact, even in the Kyoto era, there was this issue that the wood fuel carbon emission factor could not be directly used for projects which were for clean cooking. So there was a way around which was used in the Kyoto system to have this discounting factor, which Michael alluded to. But yeah, we don't know how exactly the future methodologies will look like. One area to look for is some guidance may be forthcoming in the Article 6.4 supervisory body meetings going forward, where there is guidance, as I mentioned earlier, to look into methodologies which are applicable to POAs and then make them compatible with Article 6. So that's one space. Although the countries are not obliged to use those methodology alone, the country themselves, they can also agree to the participating country to choose the methodology and choose the approaches. But it's always better to have harmonized approaches across the different mechanisms. But it's a very important area. But the other things also, the overall emission quantity in the FOLU sector from this, the wood fuel area could be the portion of the emissions from the clean cooking sector is likely to be small in many of the countries. So that's also an important information to take into account, but that's indeed an important area to keep focus on and derive the parameters to monitor in the MRV system. Back to you, Elisa, thanks.
Great, thank you. This is all complicated, which was the motivating factor for our organizations in coming together and deciding that there was really a gap and a need for technical support that we are hoping that we can be able to fill for all of you that have joined us today and beyond. With that, I will turn it back over to Donnie to close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alyssa, and everybody who presented today. I even learned a lot every time I listen to Gaj. I continue to learn more. It is very complicated, and there is a lot that we think that with the group that we have here can provide in terms of support to countries out there who are looking to really include clean cooking in their NDCs and to really set up programs. So next steps are to look out for a CCA climate team email. We will send you working drafts of both guidance documents for review and feedback. And if your country is interested in participating, please fill out the link because we will have office hours and we will provide as much support as possible to the countries who are interested in support for these areas. So again, thank you everybody who presented. Thank you to those who joined the webinar, and we look forward to being in touch. Have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you.